The wind dragged dust along the crooked main street of Red Creek, rattling loose shutters and whistling through the gaps of half-abandoned buildings. It was late past the hour when honest folk had retreated to their cabins, leaving the saloon lights as the only glow in the dark. Inside Burke's place, the piano had gone silent, replaced by the low murmur of gamblers and the clink of glasses. No one looked toward the back room, though they all knew what happened there. In a town ruled by fear, silence was cheaper than courage. Sarah Dawson pressed her back against the splintered chair rope biting into her wrists. Her younger brother Samuel sat beside her, face-pale eyes too wide for his 16 years. Across the table, Burke leaned his elbows down fat fingers, rolling dice idly as if he had all the time in the world. His man Sykes leaned in the corner, with his knife twirling the blade in lazy circles. "You know the debt girl," Burke said, his voice like gravel soaked in whiskey. "Your father borrowed, your father lost, and now he's gone. That leaves you, unless, of course, the boy here wants to pay." His smile widened, cruel, daring Samuel to speak. Samuel swallowed hard but stayed silent. Sarah shook her head quickly, shielding him with the only thing she still had, her will. "I'll do what it takes," she said, her voice trembling, though she forced it to steady. "Just leave him out of it." Burke chuckled, leaned back, and let his eyes crawl across her face. "Brave girl. Shame bravery doesn't pay debts." He nodded to Sykes. The knife stilled. The air thickened. Samuel tried to twist free, but the rope cut deeper. From the front room, laughter rose and then fell muffled by the swinging doors. No one would come. Not the law, not the preacher, not even the neighbors who had once smiled at her mother in church. In Red Creek, Burke's coin carried more weight than truth. Then it came, a sound Sarah had not expected. The heavy scrape of boots across wooden floorboards. A man's shadow filled the doorway before he even spoke. His name was Eli Carter, though most in town had forgotten him. Once a soldier, once a rancher, now little more than a weathered drifter with gray at his temples and scars hidden beneath a faded coat. He had walked into the saloon for tobacco, nothing more. But the moment he heard Sarah's words, "I'll do what it takes," something inside him broke open, something buried for 10 long years. His daughter had said the same thing once before the fever took her, before his wife's grief hollowed him out and left him alone. He had promised himself he would never again be drawn into the suffering of others. But some promises crumble in the face of cruelty. Burke glanced up, irritation flashing across his face. "This is private business, Carter. Turn around and finish your drink." His hand never left the dice, but his voice carried the weight of threat. Eli did not move. His eyes settled on Sarah, saw the desperation etched into her, the way she angled her body to shield her brother. His jaw tightened. For the first time in years, his fingers twitched toward the revolver that had slept at his hip like a ghost. "I don't think this is business," Eli said, his voice low, gravelly from disuse. "This is robbery, and worse." The room froze. Samuel's breath caught in his throat. Sarah looked at the stranger, confusion warring with a fragile hope. Burke's smirk spread, though his eyes narrowed. "You want to pay her debt, old man? Fine. Throw your coin on the table and get out before I change my mind." Eli stepped fully into the room, boots heavy, shoulders square despite the weight of years. "I'll pay nothing," he said, "but I won't let you take them either." For a heartbeat, silence stretched like a drawn bow. Then Sykes laughed, a harsh bark that echoed against the walls. "You hear that, Burke? The old ghost thinks he's still a gunslinger." The knife gleamed as he spun it once more. Eli's hand drifted closer to his revolver. His mind screamed at him to walk away, to let the town rot in its own corruption. But then Samuel whispered, "Please," so faintly that only Eli heard. And Sarah's eyes, though filled with fear, held a quiet plea that pulled him back from the darkness of his own exile. The decision was made. The past no longer mattered. Only this moment did. Burke's grin faltered when Eli's revolver cleared leather with a smoothness that spoke of countless battles long ago. The hammer clicked back, the sound louder than the storm outside. The years had not rusted his aim, nor dulled the steel in his gaze. "Untie them," Eli said. His voice was calm, steady, a command more than a request. Burke's lips curled, but there was hesitation now. Everyone in Red Creek had heard stories of Eli Carter, the soldier who had survived battles no man should have lived through. Stories of a shot that never missed a temper, that never flinched. Stories Burke had dismissed until now. The dice slipped from Burke's fingers and rolled across the table, clattering in the silence. Sykes stiffened, his knife half raised, but Eli's revolver shifted just enough to make the choice clear. The boy and girl would walk free, or Sykes would fall before he ever took a step. Samuel's chest heaved. Sarah's lips parted, words failing her as tears blurred her vision. For the first time that night, she felt the edge of hope press against the suffocating dark. Burke spat on the floor, cursed under his breath, and sliced the rope with one sharp tug. Samuel staggered forward into Sarah's arms, their embrace fierce, desperate, alive. Sykes growled but dropped his knife when Eli's eyes cut toward him with cold promise. "Take your brother," Eli told Sarah, his gaze never leaving Burke. "Get outside. Don't stop until you reach the edge of town." She nodded, trembling, and pulled Samuel toward the door. Each step was heavy, as if the floor might vanish beneath them. But they moved, and that movement was victory. Burke leaned back, fury in his glare. "You'll regret this, Carter. No one crosses me and walks away. You think you can fight me? Fight the law, fight this whole town." Eli lowered the revolver only slightly, just enough to holster it with deliberate calm. His words came like stone falling into water, steady and final. "I don't need to fight the whole town, just you." Outside, the wind howled louder, carrying with it the promise of storms to come. The night was not over. For Sarah and Samuel's survival was just the beginning. For Eli Carter, the choice to stand once more would awaken enemies buried deep and allies he did not yet know he had. And as the three of them stepped into the shadows of Red Creek streets, none could see how much blood, sacrifice, and redemption the coming days would demand. Dawn came to Red Creek like a bruise, fading first purple, then a weak wash of pale gold. Mist rose in frayed ribbons from the creek bed and drifted over the low grass fields beyond town. Eli Carter watched it from the porch of the abandoned bunkhouse he had opened in the night, a place where ranch hands once slept and laughed before drought and debt had driven them away. Now it was shelter, bare walls, a pot-bellied stove, and a roof that kept out most of the wind. Inside, Sarah coaxed a small fire to life with dry slivers from a broken chair. Samuel sat near the door with a blanket over his shoulders, eyes rimmed red from a night without sleep. The boy glanced at Eli through the half-open doorway, as if the older man might vanish if not watched carefully. "Eat," Eli said, setting a dented tin on the threshold. Inside lay cold beans he had found in a cupboard and warmed over the flame. "It's not much, but it will steady you." Sarah took the tin and split it in two with a spoon, giving the larger share to Samuel, despite his protests. When she looked up, her gaze met Eli's. Gratitude lived there, and something else he recognized, fear harnessed into resolve. "We can't stay long," she said. "Burke won't wait." "No," Eli agreed. "He won't. He'll go to Deputy Crow as soon as the saloon doors swing at noon, maybe earlier. Crow's a man who sells the law by the pound. Burke pays heavy." Samuel's jaw tightened. "So we run." Eli shook his head. "Run where Burke's fingers touch every trail out of Red Creek. He'll send men to the crossings, to the water holes. And if Crow writes a paper with your names on it, half the ranchers will turn you in just to stay on the good side of the badge." Sarah set the spoon down carefully. "Then what do we do?" Eli looked past them to the stove's glow. He could hear another fire, one from a decade ago, the fever that took his child, the rage that burned through the woman he had loved, until only ash remained between them. He had wandered since then, not because he was lost, but because standing still meant feeling the full weight of what he could not change. "First," he said, "we make sure you're not alone." He nodded toward the town where faint movement stirred under the pale morning. "Burke thinks he owns Red Creek, but he only rents it from the people who are too afraid to say no. Fear can be reclaimed. It just needs a place to gather." Sarah considered him for a long moment. "And if they don't gather, then we make a smaller stand," Eli replied. "One that holds until a larger one is possible." He stepped from the porch and they followed. The main street had begun to stir, a woman sweeping her stoop with quick, nervous strokes. A boy leading a milk cow across the way, its hooves clopping soft in the dust. The blacksmith Nolan Pike hauling a coal sack toward his forge. Nolan looked up when he saw Eli and paused. His eyes flicked to Sarah and Samuel, then to Eli again, weighing what it meant. Eli lifted a hand in greeting. "Morning, Nolan." "Morning." Nolan hesitated, then shifted the sack to his other shoulder. "Heard there was noise at Burke's last night." "There was." Nolan's mouth pressed into a line. "You aim to make more of it today." "That depends," Eli said, "on whether Red Creek still knows the difference between a man and a bully." Nolan studied him, then the siblings. He was a big man, muscles layered by years at the anvil, but there was a worn softness around his eyes that came from seeing too many small defeats. "You tell me how I'd know that," he said. Eli's answer was simple. "By which one you side with at noon." Nolan didn't commit. He only gave a small nod and turned into his shop where steel would soon ring against steel. But the exchange hung in the air like a promise not yet spoken. They moved on. At the general store, Mrs. O'Rourke stood behind the counter with a ledger thicker than a family Bible. She glanced up as they entered, fingers stopping mid-column. For a heartbeat, her face softened at the sight of the boy's thinness, then hardened again under the drag of caution. "Morning," Eli said, placing 3 coins down. "Coffee and cartridges." She slid the coffee across without comment. When her hand reached for the cartridges, it slowed. "Burke's men bought up most of the 44s yesterday," she murmured. Her eyes lifted to Eli's. "Said there might be trouble." "There might," Eli said. She set a half-empty box on the counter. "That's all I have left in that size." "It will do." He nudged the coins forward. She counted fewer than the price, and when Eli looked at her, she met his gaze square. "I keep a ledger for debts and for fear," she said. "Sometimes I lower what either of those costs." Eli tipped his hat a fraction. "Then mark me down for owing you gratitude I intend to repay." As they stepped back into the street, distant hooves drummed from the west. Burke's riders appeared as moving smudges on the horizon, growing to shapes and faces as they neared. Burke himself rode in the center, broad shoulders filling his coat, Sykes at his right hand with a new knife at his belt, and last night's humiliation burning in his eyes. They reined in outside the saloon. Deputy Crow emerged, their badge, bright as fresh coin hat, tipped low. He drew a slow line in the dust with the heel of his boot, a child's gesture turned mean by the weight he meant it to carry. "All right, folks," Crow called, voice easy as a snake's slide. "There was an incident last night. Disturbance of the peace, theft of service, harboring debt evaders. We'll be collecting the Dawson pair for lawful proceedings." A curtain lifted across the street. The broom on the stoop fell silent. Even the milk cow seemed to chew more carefully. Eli stepped forward until his boot stood just shy of the line Crow had drawn. "If by proceedings you mean Burke's back room and Sykes's knife, then I reckon the law needs a new dictionary." Burke smiled without warmth. "You got brave since last night, Carter. Or maybe just foolish." "I stayed the same," Eli said. "It's the daylight that makes you look different." Crow let the silence stretch, then tapped the badge with one finger. "The law says those Dawsons were pledged for debt. You interfere, you obstruct." "The law says a lot," Eli answered, "when it's worn by a coward." His voice didn't rise, but the words carried. They slid between doors and windows into kitchens and shops, into the places where people had tucked away their fury for safekeeping. Sykes shifted hand on his knife. "Let me take him, Burke." Burke lifted 2 fingers, restraint that felt more like a favor he would later collect. "Not yet." Eli could feel Sarah and Samuel at his back, too close and too far at once. He didn't look around. He only set his feet like a man who expects the wind to blow harder and plants himself accordingly. Nolan Pike came out of the forge, then black, with soot and shining with sweat, a hammer in his hand. He didn't say a word. He simply took a place on Eli's left. A beat later, Mrs. O'Rourke appeared on the store's threshold, ledger clutched like a shield chin lifted. A miner from the hills, a seamstress with pins in her mouth, the boy with the milk cow. One by one, they stepped closer, not to fight, not yet, but to witness without flinching. Crow's smirk faltered. Burke's eyes narrowed, calculating. "This won't last," he said. "When the first shot's fired, they'll scatter." "Maybe," Eli said. "Maybe not. But the first shot won't come from us." He unbuckled his gun belt, slow and deliberate, and laid the revolver across his open palms like an offering. Then he spoke loud enough for every doorway to hear. "I won't draw on a badge, not even one that's been pawned. If you want the Dawsons, you'll have to walk through me unarmed as I am. And you'll have to do it while these people watch." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Courage, like fear, is contagious. Crow's lip curled. "You think putting down your iron makes you righteous?" "No," Eli said. "I think it makes your choice clearer." Sykes took a step, impatient. Burke flicked him a glance that said not yet again, but Sykes's pride ran hotter than orders. He lunged, knife flashing. Nolan's hammer rose in a blur. It met Sykes's wrist with a crack that sounded like dry wood splitting. The knife flew, landed in the dust, and spun on its point before falling flat. Sykes staggered back, cursing, clutching his hand. Gasps hit the air, sharp and many. Crow's face went bright as the badge rage flaring where confidence had been. Eli didn't move. "Last chance," he said to Crow. "Be the law, not Burke's echo." For a long breath, the deputy stood in the center of his own line, staring at the people who had stopped being shadows. He saw the seamstress's pins, the miner's cracked knuckles, the blacksmith's hammer, the grocer's ledger. He saw the boy with the cow holding the rope like a banner without meaning to. And he saw Burke looking at him not as a partner, but as a tool he might discard if it dulled. Crow spat a small wet sound in a vast silence. Then he stepped back half a pace. It wasn't surrender, not yet. It was something smaller and more telling hesitation. Burke's smile thinned to nothing. This isn't finished. It never is, Eli said, but it changes today. Burke gathered his reins. Enjoy your little parade. When night falls, parades end. They wheeled their horses and pounded away, dust boiling in their wake. Only when the street settled did Eli pick up his gun belt and rebuckle it. He turned to Sarah and Samuel. The boy was trembling again, but not from the same helpless fear. Sarah's hands shook, yet her chin was firm. This buys time, Eli said quietly, not safety. How much time, Sarah asked. Enough, he said, though he didn't know if it was true. Enough to find allies who don't just watch. Enough to learn where Burke keeps his ledgers and what names he's written in them without consent. Enough to show the circuit judge proof when he rides through in 3 days. 3 days, Sarah repeated as if the number were a bridge they might cross if they stepped carefully. Nolan wiped his brow. You'll need more than words in a crowd when he comes back after dark. Eli nodded. We'll need a plan. He looked down at the line Crow had drawn. The wind had already begun to blur it, turning hard edges to smudges. Lines were like that, he thought. You could draw them in dust all day. The only ones that held were the ones you carried inside and made real by how you stood. Tonight, he said, we choose where to stand. And as the sun climbed, Red Creek felt something it had not felt in a long while. A weight lifting a breath shared a first step taken. Far out on the prairie, dust rose again like smoke on a fuse. Night would come, and with it wolves in men's clothes. But for the first time, Red Creek would not meet the dark alone. The sun burned low on the horizon, staining the plains with fire before sinking into the teeth of the western hills. Shadows stretched long across Red Creek, and every shadow seemed to carry a threat. The townsfolk who had stood in the street at noon were quieter now, shutters pulled tight, lamps extinguished early. Courage had flickered in daylight, but night carried a colder weight. Inside the bunkhouse, Sarah patched a tear in her brother's shirt with clumsy stitches, her fingers trembling, though she tried to keep them steady. Samuel sat stiffly, flinching at every hammer strike from Nolan's forge down the lane. They'll come tonight, he whispered. Burke won't wait. Sarah swallowed hard, but her reply was firm. Then we'll face it tonight. She looked at Eli, who leaned against the doorframe, cleaning his revolver with a rag so worn it was more thread than cloth. Won't we? Eli did not answer at once. His eyes were on the twilight beyond the porch, where the horizon had begun to blur into darkness. He thought of battles fought under the same sky battles, where night meant death for the slow and despair for the weak. We will, he said finally, but not on their terms. Nolan arrived before the last light was gone, hammer hanging at his side. Behind him came Mrs. O'Rourke, breathless from the walk, and 3 miners with dust still clinging to their clothes. The seamstress, too, with pins stuck in her collar, like tiny weapons. They gathered in the cramped space shoulders, brushing a crowd of ordinary folk who had discovered that standing together was easier than standing alone. What's the plan? Carter Nolan asked. I can swing this hammer till my arm breaks, but I'd rather know what for. Eli set the revolver aside and drew a rough map in the dirt with the edge of his boot. Burke's pride is wounded. He won't let the night pass without striking back. He'll bring men, maybe 10, maybe more. They'll ride heavy and they'll try to scare you into scattering before a shot's even fired. His voice stayed low even, but his eyes moved over each of them, pinning them like nails. If you run, it's over. If you hold even for minutes, the town sees it. Fear cracks, and once it cracks, it never fits together again. Mrs. O'Rourke folded her arms tight across her chest. And if they shoot first, then we make sure it's the last shot they fire, Eli said. The room grew still. Sarah looked from face to face, wondering which would stay and which would break. To her surprise, none stepped back. Night fell full and heavy. The only light came from a lantern on the bunkhouse porch and the forge's glow down the street. The air smelled of iron and coal smoke, sharp as a promise. Then came the sound, the drumming of hooves, many of them beating the dirt road like war drums. Dust rose ghostly under the moon. Burke rode at the front, Sykes beside him with his bandaged wrist, rage raw in his eyes. Behind them trailed 7 more rough men with rifles across their saddles. Their silhouettes loomed against the faint starlight shadows, stretched into monsters. They reined in just short of the bunkhouse. Burke's voice carried thick with amusement and menace. Evening, Carter. Looks like you found yourself an audience. Shame it'll scatter soon enough. Eli stepped forward, rifle in hand, lantern glow sharp across his face. Evening, Burke. You can turn around and let this end here. No one has to bleed. Burke laughed to sound like breaking glass. Oh, there'll be bleeding. The only question is whether it's yours or the girls or the boys. His gaze slid towards Sarah and Samuel, lingering like a stain. Debts don't vanish with daylight. Nolan's hammer struck the porch rail, ringing like a bell. Enough of your talk, Burke. You've leeched off this town long enough. The townsfolk behind him murmured in agreement, voices low but steady. Mrs. O'Rourke raised her chin. We won't hide in our homes while you poison us. Not tonight. For the first time, Burke's grin faltered. His men shifted uneasy under the weight of more eyes than they had expected. Sykes hissed, Let me take the boy, Burke. One cut and they'll all run. But Eli's rifle barrel lifted steady as stone. Try it, he said, voice like iron dragged slow across rock. I've got enough bullets to bury every man who rides with you, and they'll put their hands to the digging. His words settled heavy in the cool air, carried into every corner of the street. Burke's fingers twitched on the reins. He had planned to strike quick to break the old soldier and scatter the rest like frightened cattle. But the way the crowd stood silent, firm watching, gnawed at his certainty. Fear was still there, yes, but it no longer bent as easily as it had yesterday. A shot cracked, suddenly sharp and wild, from one of Burke's men at the rear. The bullet bit into the porch post, splintering wood. Samuel cried out, and Sarah pulled him down, heart thundering. The crowd gasped, the line between courage and chaos trembling. Eli did not flinch. His rifle barked once, and the shooter pitched backward out of the saddle, hitting the dirt with a thud that silenced even the horses. Smoke curled from Eli's barrel. His eyes were cold, unblinking. That was your warning, he said. Next one won't get the courtesy. The silence that followed was deeper than any night could hold. Burke sat rigid, his men shifting nervously. The crowd behind Eli breathed as one, fear braided with something sharper resolve. Burke spat into the dust. You've bought yourself a night, Carter. But when the sun rises, you'll find the law in your neck and this town back in my hand. He jerked his reins, wheeling his horse. Come on. His men followed, though not all with eagerness. As they thundered away, Sarah let out a shuddering breath. Samuel pressed his face into her shoulder, shaking. Nolan exhaled slow, like a bellows emptying. Eli lowered the rifle. They'll come harder tomorrow, he said. Burke's pride won't survive another wound, and Crow will give him the badge to sharpen it. Sarah looked at him, her voice unsteady but sure. Then tomorrow we don't just hold. Tomorrow we fight. Eli studied her, the fire in her eyes against the tremble in her hands. He saw his daughter there, not in face but in spirit, the same unyielding spark that refused to bend even when the world pressed cruelly. He nodded once. Then tomorrow Red Creek decides whether it lives on its knees or on its feet. The lantern flickered, shadows stretching across every wall. Outside, the night held its breath, waiting. The line had been drawn. The next crossing would not be words. Morning rolled into Red Creek, heavy with dust and silence. A sky the color of dull steel hung low, threatening rain, but giving none. Folks moved about slower than usual, as if the night's tension had sunk into their bones. No one asked what would happen next, they already knew. At the bunkhouse, Sarah stirred a pot of thin porridge while Samuel lingered near the window, peering out every few seconds. His hands were restless, picking at the wood frame, chewing the skin at his nails. They'll come this morning, won't they? He asked without looking back. They'll come, Eli said from the porch, sharpening his knife, though his rifle leaned within arm's reach. Men like Burke don't let humiliation sit long. Crow even less. Pride is a hungry beast. Sarah carried the porridge outside, 2 tin bowls balanced carefully. She handed one to Eli, who accepted it with a nod. She didn't speak, but her eyes held the question that had hung since last night. Can we win, Eli? Read it there, plain as print. But he didn't answer. He had learned long ago that hope was not given in words. It was proven in blood and bone. By mid-morning, the hoofbeats came again. This time slower, heavier, not a raid, but a procession. Crow rode at the front, his badge catching the weak light like a shard of false gold. Burke was beside him, stiff in the saddle, his face carved with rage. Behind them came more riders, 11, maybe 12, armed with rifles and clubs. The street emptied as they approached. Curtains fluttered, doors shut quick. Only Nolan Pike stayed visible, hammer tucked through his belt as he stood outside his forge. The seamstress watched from her porch with her arms folded, a needle still stuck in her sleeve. Mrs. O'Rourke waited at her store's door, her jaw set. They were not many, but they were not invisible. Crow halted in front of the bunkhouse, his horse stamping in the dust. He tipped his hat with mock courtesy. "Morning, Carter. Seems we've got official business." He drew a folded paper from his coat, waved it like scripture. "By order of the county court, Sarah and Samuel Dawson are to be taken into custody for debts unpaid. Burke here is their legal creditor. The law is clear." Eli stepped down from the porch, rifle in hand, though pointed low. "That paper wasn't signed by any judge worth the ink. I've seen enough lies dressed in uniforms to know the difference." Burke sneered. "You calling the law a lie?" "I'm calling you a lie," Eli said evenly. "And Crow's badge doesn't turn lies into truth." The crowd that had begun to gather at the edges of the street shifted uneasily. Fear pressed at them, but something else lingered now, too, anger sharp and rising. Sarah stepped forward before Eli could stop her. Her voice trembled but carried. "My father owed you nothing but grief. The money you claim was stolen with cards and whiskey. Everyone here knows it." She swept her gaze across the bystanders, blacksmith, seamstress, miners, shopkeepers. "How many of you owe him too? How many of you bend to his rules because Crow calls it law?" A murmur rippled through the street, louder than before. The curtain in one window dropped. A man who had been hiding stepped closer to listen. Crow's face flushed, his grin tightening like a noose. "Enough of this. They come with me now." He turned to his riders. "Seize them." Nolan's hammer rang against the rail of his porch, the sound splitting the air like a bell. "No one seizes anyone in this town without a fair word spoken first." Eli lifted his rifle steady and calm. "You heard him, Crow. You want them, you take them through us." The riders hesitated. Some glanced at Burke, others at Crow. They had expected fear, not defiance. The memory of last night's shot hung between them like smoke, Eli's single bullet, and the man it dropped. Burke snarled, rage fraying his voice. "You think this rabble makes you strong, Carter? They'll scatter when blood spills." "Maybe," Eli said, "but you'll be the first to bleed." The standoff stretched seconds long as hours. The town held its breath. A crow cawed from a rooftop, harsh and lonely. Then the seamstress stepped into the street pins, glinting at her collar. "Burke cheated my brother of his ranch," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried. "We stayed quiet. We were wrong." A miner followed. "He took my wages for a bottle, and Crow said it was fair. I say no more." One by one, others edged forward. A store clerk, a stable hand, even a woman with a babe on her hip. Each voice added weight to the air until Crow's smirk faltered and Burke's face blanched with fury. Sarah's hand found Samuel squeezing tight. Eli felt the ground shift beneath them, not in danger, but in power. The line he had spoken of was no longer his alone, it was theirs. Crow barked enough. "You all stand against the law, you'll hang for it." "No," Eli said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "We stand for the law. The one that protects the weak, not the one you sell by the ounce." Burke spat into the dirt, eyes burning. "This ain't over, Carter." "No," Eli agreed. "It's just begun." Crow glared at the crowd, weighing the odds. Too many eyes, too much anger. His riders shifted, restless. With a curse, he stuffed the paper back into his coat and jerked his reins. "Mount up. We'll settle this another day." They wheeled their horses and thundered off, leaving the town in silence, broken only by the creak of saddles fading into distance. For a moment, no one moved. Then slowly Nolan lifted his hammer in the air, and the crowd let out a cheer, not loud but fierce, like the growl of a fire catching hold. Sarah turned to Eli, breathless. "We did it." Eli shook his head. "We bought a day, that's all." "But it's ours," she said, her chin lifting. "And tomorrow we'll buy another." Eli looked at her, then at the steel she carried beneath the fear, and for the first time in years he almost believed in tomorrow. The next day dawned clear, the kind of bright blue sky that mocked the tension pressing down on Red Creek. The air smelled of dust, and horses sharp with the promise of heat. The townsfolk tried to move about their chores, fetching water, mending fences, sweeping stoops, but every glance tilted toward the horizon, every ear strained for hoofbeats. Burke would not lick his wounds quietly, everyone knew it. Inside Nolan Pike's forge, Eli spread a crude map of the town across the anvil. Nolan wiped his blackened hands on a rag and leaned close, sweat still streaking down his neck from the morning's fire. Sarah and Samuel sat nearby, listening as though their lives depended on every word. Mrs. O'Rourke hovered in the doorway, arms crossed, ledger pressed tight against her chest like armor. They'll come from the west, Eli said, tapping the map with a calloused finger. Wide trail, easy riding keeps the dust at their backs. Burke's pride's been cut twice now. He'll bring more men from outlying ranches, maybe drifters he's bought with whiskey and coin. Could be 20, maybe more. Samuel swallowed, his voice barely steady. And us, we have a blacksmith, a shopkeeper, a seamstress, and a few miners. We can't fight 20. We don't fight them head on, Eli said. We hold them. We stall. Long enough to make it clear Red Creek won't be broken again. Long enough for the circuit judge to ride through and see the truth with his own eyes. Nolan grunted. 3 days till the judge comes. Feels like an ocean away. Then we build a bridge, Eli said simply. By noon, preparations filled the town. The miners stacked crates and barrels into rough barricades. The seamstress and her apprentices tore canvas into strips for bandages, their needles flashing as they stitched makeshift pouches for powder and shot. Nolan hammered out iron spikes to scatter across the street, his anvil ringing steady as a war drum. Even children carried buckets of water, lining them near doorways in case fire became Burke's weapon. Eli moved among them, giving quiet instructions, steadying hands. He never raised his voice, never boasted. He didn't need to. His calm was a kind of command one people obeyed without thinking. Sarah watched him closely, the lines of age cut deep into his face, the weight of memory shadowing his eyes. He carried grief like other men carried guns, but in his grip it had become something sharper, resolve. That evening, Samuel approached Eli as he loaded his rifle. The boy's hands shook, but his jaw was firm. Teach me, he said. If they come, I want to stand too. Eli studied him a long moment. Samuel's shoulders were too narrow, his face too young, but his eyes carried the same fire that had brought the town to the street 2 days before. Eli handed him a small revolver, its handle worn smooth. This was my father's, he said. Don't lift it unless you're ready to live with where the bullet lands. Samuel nodded, swallowing hard. He held the revolver with both hands as if it might vanish if he loosened his grip. Night fell with a strange stillness. The stars above were sharp, glittering, indifferent. The townsfolk huddled behind their barricades, lanterns dimmed to slivers. Sarah sat near the bunkhouse, her brother beside her, listening to the restless shuffle of boots and the distant cry of coyotes. She whispered a prayer her mother once taught her, words half forgotten but still heavy with hope. Then far off came the sound, the low thunder of many hooves rolling across the plains. Dust rose on the western horizon, glowing faint under the moonlight like a storm gathering. The people of Red Creek stiffened, breath's shallow hands tightening on tools turned into weapons. Eli stepped into the center of the street, rifle resting across his arms. His shadow stretched long under the lantern, glow a single figure standing where the road narrowed between the barricades. The riders came into view, Burke at their head, Sykes beside him, and behind them a column of armed men, faces, hard eyes, hungry for coin and cruelty. 20, maybe more. Enough to crush a town that had only just remembered its spine. They drew up short horses, snorting dust, swirling. Burke's voice rang out, dripping with triumph. Look at this, the great Eli Carter and his little parade of sheep. You think crates and courage will stop me? You think a broken old soldier makes you safe? Eli lifted his rifle, slow, deliberate. His voice carried calm, steady as stone. No, I think the truth makes us safe. And the truth is, you've stolen from these people long enough. Tonight it ends. Burke's laughter cracked the night. It ends all right, but with fire and screams. Men, he raised his hand. Ride them down. The charge came like a wave, hooves pounding, voices, shouting, weapons flashing in the moonlight. The barricades shook as the first riders slammed against them. Arrows of fear shot through the crowd, but they held. Nolan swung his hammer, knocking a rider from his saddle. The miners hurled rocks and swung pickaxes, their muscles built from years underground, now turned to war. Mrs. O'Rourke swung a ledger like a club, eyes blazing. Gunfire cracked. Eli's rifle barked, dropping one man then another. Samuel, heart-hammering, raised the revolver and fired wild, the shot whistling past, but enough to make a rider flinch back. Sarah dragged him down before a bullet whined over their heads. The street became chaos, dust, smoke, shouts, steel on steel. But through it all, Eli moved like the man he once was, every shot precise, every step deliberate. Fear clawed at him, but it could not breach the wall he had built inside. Burke pushed through the melee, eyes locked on Eli, hatred bright as flame. You'll die for this, Carter, he bellowed, drawing his pistol. Eli turned rifle empty, and the two men faced each other in the heart of the storm. Around them, Red Creek fought and bled, but in that instant it felt as if the whole world narrowed to one truth: only one of them would still stand when the dust settled. And as Burke leveled his gun, Eli's hand drifted toward the revolver at his hip, the night holding its breath for the shot that would decide Red Creek's fate. The street of Red Creek was a storm of smoke and hooves, screams, and steel. The barricades rattled under the weight of riders' lantern light, swinging madly with each blast of gunfire. Yet in the middle of that chaos, the world narrowed to two men, Eli Carter and Burke. Burke's pistol gleamed under the moonlight, steady in his thick hand. His grin was twisted triumphant, as if victory already belonged to him. "End of the road, old man," he spat. "You should have stayed a ghost." Eli's rifle lay empty at his side, but his hand hovered over the revolver at his hip. His heartbeat slowed, a steady drum against the thunder around him. The years between this moment and the warfields of his youth vanished. He remembered smoke thick as night, remembered the weight of pulling a trigger, and the silence that always followed. He had sworn never again. But some oaths were meant to be broken. "Maybe I should have," Eli said, voice calm as a drawn blade. "But then who would have stopped you?" Burke fired. The pistol cracked flame, spitting into the night. Eli dropped, rolling to the side, dust bursting where he'd stood. His revolver cleared leather in the same motion, the hammer snapping back with a sharp click. He fired once, the bullet grazing Burke's arm and spinning him half around. Burke roared in pain, clutching his sleeve. Fury twisted his face as he raised the pistol again. But Eli was already on his feet, steady, shoulders squared. His revolver barked a second time, the shot ripping through Burke's hat and tearing it from his head. The crowd gasped, the moment suspended, the whole battle hanging on a thread of smoke. Sykes, seeing his master falter, lunged from the side with his knife flashing. Samuel shouted Eli. His voice cracked with fear. Eli turned just as Sykes leapt, blade aimed for his chest. Sarah moved before she thought. Snatching up a dropped rifle, she swung it like a club. The butt slammed into Sykes' shoulder, sending him stumbling sideways. His knife caught only Eli's coat-slicing fabric instead of flesh. Eli fired once more, point blank. Sykes fell into the dust, his knife spinning from limp fingers. The tide shifted. The riders, seeing Burke wounded and Sykes down, wavered. Some pressed forward out of blind loyalty, but most pulled back, doubt spreading like fire through dry grass. Nolan swung his hammer, dropping another attacker. The miners surged, striking hard with pickaxes and shovels. The seamstress shouted orders, like a general rallying the women who had armed themselves with broom handles and boiling water. Burke staggered, clutching his bleeding arm pistol, shaking. His eyes burned with hatred. "You think this town will remember you as a hero, Carter? You'll die in the dirt like the rest of them. Men like me always win." Eli's revolver aimed true, his hand steady. "Not tonight." He fired. The shot struck Burke square in the chest. The outlaw reeled back, mouth open in shock, pistol tumbling from his grip. He collapsed into the dust, the sound of his fall louder than the gunfire that had filled the night. For a moment, silence followed. The riders froze, staring at their fallen leader. Then one by one, they dropped their weapons. Some spurred their horses and fled into the darkness, unwilling to die for a dead man's pride. Others simply stood, hands raised, eyes empty. The town exhaled as one. The barricades held. The people of Red Creek were bloodied, bruised, but unbroken. Sarah knelt beside Samuel, pulling him close, tears streaking her dirt-stained face. Nolan wiped his brow with a shaking hand, his hammer black with blood. Mrs. O'Rourke set down her ledger and leaned against the doorway, her chest heaving with exhausted relief. Eli holstered his revolver, the weight of it pulling against his hip like an anchor. He looked down at Burke's still body, the man who had ruled this town with fear for years, and felt no triumph, only the old familiar ache of another life, taken, another ghost added to the weight he carried. Samuel's small voice broke through the quiet. "Is it over?" Eli glanced at the boy, then at the people gathering in the street lanterns, lifting high to cast light over broken riders and battered barricades. "For him, yes," Eli said, "but not for us. Tomorrow Crow will come, and he'll bring the law with him. Tonight we stood against a bully. Tomorrow we stand against his badge." Sarah rose, her eyes fierce despite the tears. "Then we'll stand again, however many times it takes." The townsfolk murmured in agreement, voices growing louder, steadier. The fear that had ruled Red Creek for so long was broken, scattered like the dust beneath their boots. Eli looked at them, miners, women, children, shopkeepers, Ordinary souls who had chosen not to bow anymore. He felt something stir in him, something he had thought buried with his daughter and wife long ago. It wasn't joy. It wasn't pride. It was something quieter, steadier. Hope. The night still smelled of gunpowder and blood, but for the first time in years, Red Creek also smelled of freedom. And as the moon climbed higher, Eli knew the fight was not finished. The badge would come next, heavier than any outlaw's gun. But he also knew this: he would not face it alone. Morning came slow, heavy as lead. The street of Red Creek still bore scars from the night before: broken barrels, shattered glass. Dark patches of blood pressed into the dust. The people moved quietly, not in fear this time, but in exhaustion. They had stood their ground and lived. Yet everyone knew the fight was not done. Crow would come. By mid-morning, the sound of hoofbeats carried from the south. Not the wild charge of outlaws this time, but the measured cadence of riders moving with the authority of the law. Deputy Crow rode at the front, his badge polished bright, his eyes colder than steel. Behind him came 4 deputies from the county seat, their uniforms stiff, their rifles gleaming. Crow sat tall in his saddle, his voice dripping with venom. "People of Red Creek," he called, drawing the gaze of the gathered crowd. "You harbor criminals. You kill a man of business in cold blood. And you dare stand against the law of this county. By order of the sheriff, all responsible will hang." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Mothers clutched their children. Men shifted uneasily, glancing at one another. The victory of last night felt fragile now, like glass in a storm. Eli stepped forward, rifle in hand but barrel lowered. His voice carried calm, though his chest was tight. No man of law would call Burke a man of business. He was a thief, a slaver in all but name, and every soul here knows it. Crow sneered. "The law isn't about what you feel, Carter. It's about what's written. And I have it written clear: Sarah Dawson and her brother are pledged for debt. You interfered. You killed Burke, a legal creditor. You're nothing but a murderer, hiding behind scared folk." Sarah, standing beside Samuel, lifted her chin. "Burke cheated my father with marked cards and rigged dice. He stole land and coin from every family in this town. If that's law, then law is just another mask for theft." Her words lit the crowd like a spark in dry grass. Murmurs grew into shouts. "He stole my wages. He took my cattle. He bled us dry," while Crow looked the other way. Crow's smirk tightened. His hand hovered near his pistol. "Order your tongues or I'll cut them from your mouths." Nolan Pike stepped forward, hammer resting on his shoulder. "You'll have to cut through me first." Mrs. O'Rourke added in me. One by one, the townsfolk moved closer, forming a wall behind Eli, Sarah, and Samuel. Miners, mothers, seamstresses, stable hands, all the people who had lived under Burke's shadow, now stood in the open sun. Eli raised his voice, not in anger, but in iron steadiness. "You say the law is written, Crow. Fine. Then let's have it judged. The circuit judge rides this way. 3 days, maybe less. If you believe your law is true, let him read it. Let him weigh it." Crow's eyes flickered just for a heartbeat, betraying what everyone already suspected: he had no wish for a real judge to see the truth. The crowd roared louder now, voices rising together. "Judge, judge, let the judge decide." The deputies at Crow's back shifted uncomfortably. One cleared his throat. "He's right, Crow. The circuit judge is due. Best let him settle it." Crow's face twisted, rage flashing. He saw his power slipping, saw the fear he had fed on for years crumbling into dust. "You fools," he spat. "You think a judge cares about your little town? You think Carter will save you? He'll bleed you dry, same as Burke. You're sheep looking for a new master." Eli met his glare, his voice low but caring. "I don't want to be their master, just their neighbor." Crow's hand twitched toward his pistol. The street went still. For a long, breathless moment, it seemed the blood would flow again. Then Sarah stepped forward, placing herself between Eli and the deputy's aim. Her voice was clear, fierce. "If you fire Crow, you fire into the heart of this town, and we will not forget." Crow froze. The crowd surged closer, dozens of eyes burning into him. His deputies did not move to back him. The weight of the town pressed down like a mountain. Finally, with a snarl, Crow spat into the dust. "This isn't over." He jerked his reins. "Mount up." The deputies followed, though not all with conviction. Together they rode out their horses, kicking up dust that tasted of bitterness and defeat. Silence held the street for a long beat. Then slowly cheers broke out, ragged at first, then louder, rolling like thunder through Red Creek. Samuel laughed, a sound bright and alive. Sarah's tears spilled, but her smile shone through. Nolan raised his hammer high. Mrs. O'Rourke lifted her ledger. The miners clapped each other on the back. The town had chosen, and for the first time in years it had chosen itself. Eli stood apart, revolver heavy at his side, eyes on the horizon where Crow had vanished. He knew the deputy's words were true. In one way, this was not over. Enemies like Crow didn't disappear. They waited, they schemed, they struck again. But as Sarah came to stand beside him, her hand brushing against his, Eli felt something he had not felt in years. Not triumph, not peace, but the first fragile threads of belonging. He looked at Sarah, at Samuel, at the town that had risen from fear into defiance. His voice was quiet, but it carried to those nearest. The badge may come again, the law may come crooked, but so long as we stand together, they'll never bend us back into silence. Sarah nodded, her voice steady. Then we'll stand, for as long as it takes. The people of Red Creek cheered again, their voices echoing across the plains. Above them, the sun broke free of the clouds, pouring light over a town reborn. And for Eli Carter, haunted soldier-weary drifter, reluctant protector, the day felt for the first time in a long while like the beginning of something worth living for.